The heart of DaVinci Resolve is color correction or grading, which is the process of making every clip in your project look its best. Whether you'll be doing the color grading yourself or handing off your project to a dedicated colorist, the intent is to improve exposure and color balance, overcome visual inconsistencies, and manipulate color and contrast to enhance the emotion of the story you are telling. Over the next several lessons, we'll work with the industry-adopted and proven tools available in Resolve's color page. By now, you should be familiar with the drill. Open the Lesson 16 timeline if you want to follow along. At this stage, we've finished our Final Cut, done some basic audio sweetening, and sent some shots over to Fusion for effects and motion graphics work. Click the color page icon to move your timeline into the color page. The color page is divided into several work areas that all function together as you build your grade. At the top of the window are a row of buttons that let you show and hide different parts of the interface, most of which we'll get to over the next several lessons. At the center of the UI is a viewer that displays the selected clip you're working on. And below the viewer are two timelines, the thumbnail timeline and the mini timeline. The thumbnail timeline displays a single image at the start frame of every clip on every track in chronological order, kind of like visual index cards. Selecting a thumbnail loads the first frame of the clip into the viewer. Use the transport controls to play and pause the playback. Called Nelson, Nevada. Below the thumbnail timeline is the mini timeline that graphically represents the entire edit, including every clip from every track by their relative durations. Selecting a clip in the mini timeline selects it in the thumbnail timeline, and you could use its dedicated playhead to scrub over your edit. Hold down the Option or Alt key and use the scroll wheel to zoom in or out. When grading clips on one track, you might find it helpful to disable clips on another track to cut down on visual clutter. Click the track header for V2, and every clip on that track will be disabled. And the thumbnail timeline will only present clips from the V1 track. Re-enable V2. When the playhead is parked over a clip, it turns orange in both timelines to indicate the clip is active for color adjustments using the palettes below. Below each thumbnail is a text label showing the codec for each clip. Double-clicking on it switches the label to the clip names. All the keyboard shortcuts for navigating in the color page are the same ones found in the edit page. Use the up and down arrow keys to move forward or backward from clip to clip. Or use the J, K, and L keys. 80 years for reason. But in terms of its You can hide the mini timeline by clicking the Timeline button in the toolbar, or hide the thumbnail timeline by clicking the Clips button. We'll be working with a thumbnail timeline, so leave that one visible. For grading clips, many colorists prefer the simplicity of the thumbnail timeline, because it keeps the focus on just sequentially ordered shots to be graded, without regard to their timing relationships. Let's start by working on the first clip by selecting it. The viewer is black. What's going on? You may recall that we added a fade to this clip in the edit page. And since the thumbnail displays the first frame of the clip, the image is black until we move the playhead under the viewer. For a shot that has only a small fade, it most likely won't get in the way. However, if you select clip 7, you'll see that the first few frames include a wipe transition, which could obscure frames you need to see in order to grade. Click this button in the lower left of the viewer that looks like a stack of paper. This button will unmix any transitions, effects, or layered composites that mix two or more clips together, that would otherwise hide or obscure the frames you need to see. Now select clip 1, and the fade is no longer visible. Once a clip is selected, you can begin manipulating it using the color wheels in the Primaries palette in the lower left. When color correcting an image, this is often the first place you'll start. The Primaries palette divides the image into separate tonal regions, called Lift, Gamma, and Gain. These controls correspond to the shadows, midtones, and highlight regions of the image. DaVinci Resolve processes color in Y-RGB color space. The Y stands for luminance, and the RGB stands for red, green, and blue. The point is, you can manipulate the luminance of a clip separately from its color, giving you a fine control over its exposure and color. Since the human eye is most sensitive to brightness, often the best place to start when grading a clip is with the luminance controls. Below the color wheels are dials that allow you to adjust the luminance or brightness in each region. Drag on the master wheel below the lift control. Dragging to the right increases the brightness in the shadow regions, while dragging to the left decreases it. You can reset the lift control by clicking this button. Drag until the YRGB values read -0.05. Changes in this region are called black point adjustments, as you can tell by the darker parts of the image. Now let's look at the other end of the spectrum by dragging on the master wheel for the gain. Again, we see the brightness being affected, but only in the highlight regions. Drag until the value reads 1.50. Because the brighter pixels in the image have been affected, this control is called the white point adjustment. With just two small changes to the brightness for lift and gain, the image now has more contrast. With the black and white point set, we can now turn to the gamma control. The gamma wheels adjust the overall brightness of the image while maintaining any black and white point adjustments you set previously. Drag until the right until the values read 0.04. Let's compare this corrected image to the original. Go to the View menu and choose Bypass Color and Fusion. Bypass all grades. Note the shortcut Shift-D, which we'll be using from here on out. With only a few minor adjustments, the image now really pops. However, we can make it pop even more by using some additional controls along the top and bottom of the palette for making more specific adjustments to different aspects of the image, such as color temperature, contrast, saturation, hue, and so on. Let's start by boosting the saturation. In Resolve, input fields are actually sliders. Hover your pointer over the saturation input, and you'll see an icon for dragging right or left. Let's boost the saturation until the value reads 80. Press Shift-D to see a before and after. While I love the saturation boost, I would prefer a more targeted saturation adjustment. To reset a control, double-click on the item name. Color Boost is one of my favorite controls because it selectively boosts the saturation in areas of low saturation. Drag until the value reads 25. The red rust tones in the car are now more vibrant, which is why this control is sometimes called Vibrance. I also like boosting midtone detail, which gives the defined edges a bit of sharpening, which really pulls out the texture in the car. I'll set this to around 20. Clips that have been altered using any of these tools will appear with a multicolored border around the clip number in the thumbnail timeline. So, you've just completed your first grade on a clip, and it looks great. But how do you know if the image is objectively correct? This is where the very helpful video scopes come into play. Select Clip 2. This clip was shot using a log setting on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, so it has a flat, muted look. It was shot this way so that in post, we could retrieve as much image detail as possible, which is what we're about to do. However, before we start making any adjustments, we want to use a tool that will help us evaluate the image more scientifically. In the bottom right corner of the interface is a palette that is currently showing the keyframe editor. Click the button with a graph icon to bring up the video scopes. Depending on what part of the video signal you need to monitor, there are 5 scopes available from this menu. The default scope is the waveform monitor that displays a range of brightness values from absolute black, starting at line 0, to absolute white, ending at line 1023. These numerical values are based on the color depth for 10-bit images, which allows for 1024 levels of variation for each color. The waveform then displays these values in the form of these traces, in roughly the same horizontal position as the video clip it's monitoring. So this large dip in the traces is this dark sign pole on the left of the frame, and the front wheel of the bus is this circular cutout in the traces here. In the viewer, disable the sound, enable loop playback, then press the spacebar. In the scopes, the traces update in real time. The waveform is especially useful for evaluating and correcting what is often called latitude. Latitude refers to how much flexibility you have in correcting the exposure. The reason video is often shot in a log or in a RAW format is because it gives the colorist the greatest latitude in retrieving as much image detail as the clip will provide. To make working with the scopes easier, click this button to open them in a floating window. If you're seeing more than one scope in this window, click the Single Scopes button and make sure it's set for waveform. As I mentioned, this clip was captured in a log format, which compressed the luminance range between 128 and 768 in the scopes. In order to retrieve the full range of exposure the sensor captured, we'll need to stretch or expand the black and white points. Drag the Lift Master control wheel and watch the lower traces. Drag until the dark shadows in the image touch the 0 line. Now drag the gain wheel until the brightest pixels in the image touch the 1023 line. Now press Shift-D to view a before and after. We can see the image changes, but why does the image scale when we use this bypass toggle? Well, if you look in the lower right of the thumbnail, you'll see an icon that tells us we're working on a clip that was sent from the Fusion page. In the previous lesson, we animated a title and scaled it to crop out unwanted background elements. Go back to the View menu and choose Bypass Color in Fusion. Currently, they are both being bypassed. Select Fusion to remove it. Now, when you press Shift-D, only the color grades are bypassed. By the way, you can also use this button to bypass your color grades if you forget the shortcut. Looking at the traces and the image itself, the midtones look properly exposed, so we don't need to adjust the gamma. But what about the color? For that, we'll use a different but related scope. From the pop-up menu, choose Parade. The Parade scope is very much like the waveform scope, except the red, green, and blue color channels are isolated. So as you look across each channel, you can still see the same patterns in the traces with the sign pulled on the left and the wheel in the center. However, if you look at the traces for the green and blue channel, they appear slightly higher than the red channel. In a color additive system like video, pure white would have equal amounts of red, green, and blue. This image was shot using the auto balance setting of the camera, which can often work in a pinch, but in this case the area that's supposed to be white, particularly the Texaco sign, appears to have a slight bluish cast. Click the white balance eyedropper in the upper right of the Primaries palette. Move the eyedropper over the left side of the sign to the pure section of white. The tooltip reports the relative amounts of red, green, and blue in the sampled area. If the shot was completely neutral, then the value of all three color channels would be equal. But as you can see, there's less red in the image compared to the blue and green. Now click with the eyedropper to balance the shot. Auto balancing compensates for the red disparity by adjusting the color temperature of the image to make the color balance more neutral. You can see the change in the value field next to the temperature control. Press Shift-D to see a before and after. And you can tell the shot has been given a slightly warmer look. And this is a textbook example of why you cannot trust your eyes alone for evaluating and correcting an image. Color correction is an iterative process, meaning that you can often arrive at the results you want through a repeated cycle of operations. For example, we've just applied what is called a primary correction to the image, in which our exposure and color balance changes were applied to the image as a whole. The next step in the process would be to adjust the color or exposure of specific elements in the frame, often called secondary color correction. The color page provides a method for keeping each of these processes isolated through the use of nodes. Nodes should be a familiar concept as we work with them in the Fusion page. However, unlike the Fusion page that only performs one type of image process per node, nodes in the color page can have as many color correction processes as you like. Make sure Clip 2 is still selected. In the upper right, you'll see a single node in the node editor that contains all the changes we've made to the image so far. Clicking on the number in the lower left of the node toggles the correction on or off. The way a color page node works is that the image flows from the image input on the left, represented by this green dot, to the node input, which then processes the image before sending the corrected image to the output on the right. To see this, break the connection by dragging it away from the output. The image in the viewer displays the uncorrected image because the output is not receiving any image data from the node. Drag from the node's output to the image output to reconnect it. Let's look at a common scenario where you would use more than one node. Looking at this image, perhaps I want to desaturate the yellow bus, or punch up the blue in the sky. Rather than stacking these secondary corrections on a single node, we can create a separate node for just these corrections to give us more precise control over the order of our adjustments. By default, every clip has one node in the node editor. To add another node, right-click on the node and choose Add Node, Add Serial. The node is spliced into the connection path after the first node. It's called a serial node because, just like a string of Christmas lights, the connection happens in series. The new node is given the number 2 and has an orange outline to indicate that it's the currently selected node. With our new node in place, we can now use the curve controls to modify the color of the bus. Close the Scopes window, but enable it so that it appears in the lower right so we can refer to it. In the center toolbar are a group of icons to bring up various palettes. The one on the far left is the Curves palette. Select it. There are several types of curves adjustments you can access from this menu. Custom curves is the default, and they're very similar in function to the curves you find in image editing applications like Photoshop. The other curves are used for isolating various hues, luminance, and saturation values in the image. In a later lesson, we'll be using the custom curves, but for now, choose Hue versus Sat. A color spectrum appears. Move your pointer over the yellow hood on the bus. The pointer changes to an eyedropper to indicate you're about to sample a color. Click on the bus hood. In the color spectrum, 3 control points are added to the center line. The center point is the actual color you just sampled. The 2 outer points constrain the range of hues you'll be adjusting. Drag the center point upward to add saturation to the yellow, and drag downward to desaturate it. Only pixels in the image with that specific hue are affected. I prefer a slightly saturated look of the yellow tone. To include more yellow tones in the bus, drag outward on the outside control points. To narrow the range of hues being affected, drag inward. If you want to punch up the saturation of the sky, sample the sky, then drag up on the center control point. Because our secondary corrections are isolated to a separate node, we can disable just that node to compare it against the primary corrections that are isolated to the first node. If you prefer shortcuts, press Command-D for Mac and Control-D for Windows. Color correction is not just about fixing or improving your shots. It's also about creating a mood or a style. For example, you may want to make a shot appear as a nighttime exterior, even though it was shot during the day. Select Shot 16 and set the scopes to waveform. The first order of business is to deal with the contrast. Drag the contrast control until the value is 1.400. In the scopes, the brightness of the image has been stretched, creating a greater distance between the light and dark values. To change where the contrast is applied in the image, drag on the Pivot control. This slider changes the center of tonality around which the contrast is applied. Dragging to the right biases the contrast toward the shadows, and dragging to the left biases the contrast toward the highlights. We want the contrast applied to the darker areas in the image. I'm using a value of around 0.7. Now reduce the saturation to 15. For the color, drag the center control and the gain color wheel toward blue at roughly 4 o'clock. The further you drag away from the center, the more blue will be pushed into the highlights. Because these 3 color wheels overlap, the blue tones are also being applied to the midtones and shadows. To counteract the blue in the shadows, drag the control for the lift color wheel toward red at roughly 11 o'clock. This is really an interesting look. The top part of the frame is washed in blue tones, and the lower part of the frame is washed in red tones. But if we want to create a nighttime vibe, then the control should be pushed into blue, at roughly the same vector as the gain wheel. That's looking good, but there's still too much color and luminance in the image. Reduce the saturation to 10. Reduce the lift to negative 0.06. The gamma to negative 0.03. And the gain to 0.90. Press Shift-D to toggle the correction on and off. In the next lesson, we'll go a bit deeper into Resolve's toolset for primary color correction.